Welcome back to Crimson Archivium, where the past is not just remembered but brought back to life with depth and clarity. The story of 500 knights facing an army of 26,000 is not just a tale of courage. It is a dramatic episode that highlights the collision of strategy, technology, and human spirit in the medieval world. To fully understand this monumental confrontation, we must first immerse ourselves in the historical, political, and geographical context that led to such an improbable clash. During the medieval period, Europe and parts of the Near East were fractured into countless territories, principalities, and kingdoms. Warfare was a constant feature of political life, often sparked by territorial ambitions, dynastic disputes, or religious conflicts. The knights themselves were a product of this turbulent world, a class of heavily armed, highly trained warriors who were often the elite backbone of medieval armies. Their armor, mounted skill, and rigorous code of discipline made them formidable opponents. But even the most disciplined knights were usually deployed in the context of much larger armies. Facing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers would have seemed suicidal under normal circumstances. In this particular battle, the numerical imbalance was staggering. The opposing army numbered 26,000, a massive force by medieval standards capable of crushing any conventional opponent. This army was likely composed of a mix of levied infantry, archers, light cavalry, and perhaps mercenary units. While numbers alone do not guarantee victory, an army of such size possesses several advantages: the ability to surround and outflank the enemy, to sustain long battles with rotating forces, and to intimidate opponents psychologically. Many generals would have considered the knights' chances negligible at best. The smaller force, by contrast, was composed of only 500 knights. These were not ordinary soldiers. Each knight represented a lifetime of training, often beginning in early childhood, honing skills in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the art of combat. They wore heavy plate or chainmail armor, wielded lances, swords, and maces, and rode powerful warhorses trained to charge through enemy lines. More importantly, these knights were a cohesive unit, whereas the larger army was a sprawling mass of individual soldiers with varying levels of training and loyalty. The 500 knights operated as a single disciplined entity capable of executing complex battlefield maneuvers. Geography and terrain also played a crucial role in leveling the battlefield. The knights' leaders were aware that facing 26,000 men on open ground would lead to certain annihilation. Therefore, the battle took place in a location where the terrain could neutralize the advantage of numbers. Narrow passes, ridges, marshlands, or fortified choke points were ideal for such an engagement. By forcing the larger army into confined spaces, the knights could prevent them from deploying their full strength and reduce the effectiveness of cavalry charges and massed infantry assaults. In addition to the physical terrain, psychological terrain, morale, discipline, and leadership was equally decisive. The 500 knights shared a singular purpose, bonded by loyalty to their lord or cause, and were willing to fight to the death. In contrast, the massive army, while impressive in size, may have contained conscripts with little motivation beyond obligation or pay. Large armies often suffer from coordination problems, as the communication between units becomes increasingly difficult. Rumors, fear, and confusion can spread quickly, causing panic in the ranks. The knights could exploit these vulnerabilities, using targeted attacks, feigned retreats, and sudden charges to create chaos disproportionate to their numbers. Political stakes heightened the tension surrounding this encounter. In many medieval conflicts, a decisive battle could determine the fate of entire kingdoms or principalities. Victory for the knights would not only preserve their own territory, but also send a powerful message about the effectiveness of training, discipline, and leadership over sheer numerical force. Conversely, failure would mean total annihilation and a significant shift in the balance of power. The pressure on both sides was immense, and every decision, from the placement of troops to the timing of the first charge, carried the weight of history. The societal context cannot be overlooked either. Knights were part of a rigid feudal system where loyalty, honor, and martial prowess defined social status. For them, Fighting against overwhelming odds was not merely a tactical necessity, but a duty to uphold their honor and the legacy of their order. The larger army, in contrast, was likely drawn from a more diverse social composition. While disciplined generals and elite units existed within their ranks, much of the force may have consisted of peasants or soldiers motivated by pay rather than pride, creating a disparity in cohesion and morale that would prove critical on the battlefield. Finally, the broader historical narrative frames this battle as more than just an isolated incident. Medieval chroniclers often emphasized the miraculous or legendary nature of small forces defeating overwhelming odds. Such stories served multiple purposes, inspiring loyalty, glorifying leadership, and reinforcing cultural ideals about courage, faith, and divine favor. The encounter of 500 knights against 26,000 men would have been seen not merely as a military engagement, but as a symbolic struggle, a confrontation between skill and numbers, discipline and chaos, courage and intimidati. In sum, the setting for this legendary battle was defined by a combination of geographical advantage, political stakes, societal structures, and the psychological dimensions of morale and discipline. The knights, small but elite force, stood ready not only to face a vast army, but to turn the very odds against them into an opportunity. It is this intricate interplay of factors that sets the stage for one of history's most remarkable military encounters, demonstrating that in war, sheer numbers are rarely the sole determinant of victory. The image of 500 knights standing against an army of 26,000 conjures an almost mythical scene. A small band of heavily armored warriors, disciplined to perfection, ready to face insurmountable odds. Yet this was no mere fantasy. These knights were the pinnacle of medieval military training, and understanding their preparation, equipment, organization, and mindset reveals how such a small force could achieve a victory that seemed impossible on paper. At the heart of the knights' effectiveness was their training. From early childhood, a knight's life was shaped to create a warrior capable of unmatched precision, endurance, and adaptability in battle. Boys of noble birth typically began as pages at around 7 years old, serving in the households of other nobles. Here, they learned the basics of etiquette, literacy, horsemanship, and weapon handling. By adolescence, they became squires, directly assisting a senior knight, tending to horses, airing for armor, and learning the nuances of combat. This period of apprenticeship was intensive, as the squire honed the skills necessary for the battlefield. Mastery of the lance, sword, shield, and crucially, mounted combat. By the time they were knighted, usually in their late teens or early 20s, these warriors were more than just fighters. They were living weapons, trained to think, react, and coordinate with their fellow knights in the chaos of battle. Unlike ordinary soldiers who might lack discipline or experience, these knights could maintain formation under extreme stress, respond to changing battlefield conditions, and execute complex maneuvers with precision. Every swing of a sword or thrust of a lance was calculated, reflecting years of rigorous training and mental conditioning. Equipment and armor also gave the knights a decisive edge. A fully armored knight could weigh anywhere from 45 to 60 kilograms, 100 to 130 pounds, in plate or chainmail, yet this weight was carefully distributed to allow mobility rather than hinder it. Their weapons were chosen for both reach and impact. Lances for devastating cavalry charges, swords for close combat, and maces or war hammers for piercing armor. The knight's shield, emblazoned with heraldic symbols, was not just defensive but also psychological, a symbol of identity and intimidation. Mounted on a trained warhorse, these knights became near unstoppable forces in a charge, capable of breaking enemy lines that ordinary infantry could not withstand. But the power of these 500 knights was not merely individual, it was collective. Knights rarely fought alone. They operated in units with coordinated formations, communicating through signals, banners, and prearranged tactics. Each knight understood his role in the larger strategy, whether forming a defensive wedge, executing a flanking maneuver, or holding a line to protect weaker allies. This cohesion was crucial. While the opposing army relied on numbers and brute force, the knights relied on precision, discipline, and synergy. In essence, the 500 knights acted as a single organism, each member amplifying the strength of the others. Leadership within the knights was equally critical. Medieval armies often faltered due to indecision or lack of coordination, but these 500 knights were guided by experienced commanders who understood both strategy and psychology. Leaders maintained morale, ensured discipline, and positioned their forces to exploit enemy weaknesses. They also understood the importance of timing, when to charge, when to hold, and when to feign retreat. This combination of tactical acumen and personal valor often allowed smaller forces to outmaneuver and outfight much larger armies. Another vital aspect was the psychological conditioning of knights. They were trained not only to fight but to inspire fear in the enemy. The sight of heavily armored cavalry advancing in tight formation, banners flying, and the thunder of hooves could unnerve even seasoned infantry. Knights cultivated an aura of invincibility, projecting confidence and ruthlessness that could destabilize less disciplined soldiers before the battle even began. In this way, psychological warfare was as much a tool as the sword or lance. The knights' mobility and tactical flexibility also contributed to their effectiveness. Unlike large, cumbersome armies, which could struggle to respond quickly to sudden developments, the knights were nimble, capable of rapid repositioning, concentrated strikes, and adaptive strategies. They could exploit terrain to their advantage, funneling enemies into choke points or using hills, rivers, and forests to neutralize numerical superiority. This adaptability made them unpredictable, forcing the opposing army to constantly react rather than execute their own plans effectively. Crucially, these knights were highly motivated. Loyalty to their lord, fealty to their comrades, and adherence to a code of honor provided a psychological edge that numerical superiority could not match. Many were fighting not merely for survival, but for glory, prestige, and the legacy of their order. Their courage, willingness to endure pain, and determination to hold the line against overwhelming odds made them far more than the sum of their weapons and armor. Each knight was aware that retreat or failure would not only mean personal death, but could shatter morale across the entire formation. In contrast to the massive army they face, which likely included conscripted peasants and soldiers of varying skill, these 500 knights were a highly specialized elite force. Their opponents may have had archers to rain arrows, infantry to swarm, and cavalry to flank, but without the cohesion, leadership, and discipline of the knights, their numerical advantage could be blunted. Every misstep or moment of confusion among the 26,000 could be exploited by the smaller, better-trained force, turning a tactical disadvantage into an opportunity. Finally, the knights' preparedness extended beyond mere battle readiness. They had logistical support, intelligence, and reconnaissance, often underestimated aspects of medieval warfare. Scouts could provide critical information about enemy movements, terrain obstacles, and potential ambush points. Supplies and horses were managed carefully to ensure the knights maintained peak effectiveness during prolonged engagements. This foresight allowed them to sustain their combat edge even when vastly outnumbered. In summary, the 500 knights were more than a small force. They were an elite, meticulously trained, and highly disciplined army whose effectiveness derived from a combination of physical prowess, tactical acumen, psychological preparation, and unwavering cohesion. Each knight was a master of war, but together they formed a force capable of challenging, and even defeating, an enemy more than 50 times their size. Their story reminds us that in warfare, quality, strategy, and morale can outweigh mere numbers, and that the human spirit, when disciplined and united, can achieve the extraordinary when a small, elite group of 500 knights faced an army of 26,000. The sheer scale of their opposition was awe-inspiring. Yet, as history repeatedly demonstrates, size alone is rarely sufficient to guarantee victory. To understand why the massive army ultimately failed, it is essential to examine its composition, organization, leadership, and psychological vulnerabilities, all of which contributed to the triumph of a much smaller, more disciplined force. The army of 26,000 was likely a composite force, drawn from various regions and social classes. Medieval armies were seldom homogeneous. Instead, they included levied peasants, professional soldiers, mercenaries, militia, and sometimes allied contingents with differing loyalties. Infantry formed the bulk of such forces, armed with spears, swords, axes, or improvised weapons. Archers provided ranged attacks, capable of devastating foes before they reached the front lines, while cavalry units, often lighter than the heavily armored knights, attempted to flank and harass enemy formations. The sheer variety of soldiers created a force with multiple capabilities, but also inherent weaknesses. The skill and discipline of each component could vary widely, leading to inconsistencies on the battlefield. While the numerical superiority of the 26,000 offered apparent advantages, it came with logistical and organizational challenges. Moving, feeding, and coordinating such a large body of men required careful planning and competent leadership. Armies of this size were slow, cumbersome, and prone to disorder if their chain of command faltered. The problem of communication in battle cannot be overstated. Signals could be misunderstood, orders delayed, and confusion spread rapidly. Even the most competent generals could struggle to maintain cohesion in an army of tens of thousands, especially when under pressure from a smaller, highly mobile enemy. One critical factor in the army's vulnerability was the varying levels of training and morale among its troops. While some soldiers were seasoned veterans, others were conscripts with minimal combat experience. Many may have been peasants drafted from the surrounding countryside, armed more out of necessity than skill. Without intensive training and experience, these soldiers were likely to panic under sudden stress, especially when confronted with the disciplined, relentless charge of armored knights. Morale is a fragile commodity in large armies, and fear could spread quickly, undermining the effectiveness of numerical superiority. Leadership also played a pivotal role in the army's potential weaknesses. Commanding a force of 26,000 required not only strategic vision, but the ability to inspire and control subordinates across the battlefield. Any lapse, whether from indecision, miscommunication, or underestimating the enemy, could have disastrous consequences. Large armies were often divided into multiple units, each led by its own commander, who might interpret orders differently or act independently. This decentralized structure, while necessary for managing numbers, increased the risk of fragmentation, especially when faced with an agile and coordinated enemy force. The psychological dynamics of facing a small but elite force also cannot be overlooked. The sight of 500 knights, heavily armored and mounted on powerful horses, advancing in tight formation could have a disproportionate impact on soldiers unaccustomed to such opponents. Despite the overwhelming size of their own army, the sheer intimidation factor of the knights could cause hesitation or fear among rank-and-file soldiers. This effect was compounded by the unpredictability of the knights' tactics. Unlike a standard infantry engagement, which relied on massed attacks and rigid formations, the knights employed sudden charges, flanking maneuvers, and feigned retreats, forcing the larger army to constantly adjust and disrupting its cohesion. Another significant factor was terrain and positioning. Large armies require extensive space to deploy effectively, and their strength depends on being able to maintain formation and massed firepower. If the battlefield included natural choke points, narrow passes, hills, or marshlands, the 26,000 could not leverage their numerical advantage. Crowding soldiers into constrained areas not only neutralized their superiority, but made them more susceptible to concentrated attacks from a smaller, mobile force. In such conditions, numbers became less an asset and more a liability, as overcrowding could lead to confusion, friendly fire incidents, and reduced effectiveness. The army's reliance on sheer numbers often encouraged overconfidence. Commanders may have believed that overwhelming the enemy was simply a matter of attrition. Let the knights exhaust themselves, and eventually the massed infantry and archers would prevail. However, this mindset underestimated the significance of discipline, coordination, and adaptability. While 26,000 men could overwhelm an unprepared force in theory, the knights' ability to choose the moment and location of engagement turned this advantage on its head. Overconfidence led to mistakes, poorly timed advances, gaps in the line, or underestimating the enemy's ability to exploit vulnerabilities. In addition, the army likely faced internal divisions and lack of cohesion. Medieval armies drawn from multiple regions or feudal allegiances often had fragmented loyalty. Some contingents might have been reluctant to fight, motivated only by pay or obligation. Others might have had rivalries with fellow soldiers, creating friction in the ranks. In contrast, the knights were bound by mutual trust, honor, and shared purpose. The disparity in internal cohesion meant that when the battle turned against the larger army, panic and disorder could spread rapidly, magnifying the effect. Evenness of the smaller, disciplined force. Finally, the sheer size of the army made it slow to react. While a force of 500 knights could maneuver swiftly, change formations, or retreat strategically, 26,000 soldiers required time to adjust. Signals had to be transmitted over long distances, units had to move in concert, and mistakes took longer to correct. The knights' mobility allowed them to exploit these delays repeatedly, striking where the enemy was weak and retreating before reinforcements could arrive. In summary, the army of 26,000, despite its overwhelming numbers, was vulnerable due to a combination of factors: inconsistent training, variable morale, complex logistics, fragmented leadership, psychological pressure, terrain constraints, overconfidence, and slow maneuverability. These weaknesses highlight a crucial lesson in military history: numbers alone do not win battles. Discipline, leadership, strategy, and cohesion often outweigh the raw size of an army. In this case, the army's deficiencies allowed a small, elite force of 500 knights to achieve what seemed impossible. A stunning victory that has captured the imagination of historians for centuries. The clash between 500 knights and an army of 26,000 was not only a test of strength but also a demonstration of strategy, cunning, and sheer courage. While the numbers on the battlefield seemed insurmountable, the knights had one advantage that outweighed raw force: mastery over tactics, terrain, and timing. The UNF holding of this battle provides a vivid example of how skill, discipline, and audacity can triumph over overwhelming odds. As dawn broke over the battlefield, the larger army, confident in its superior numbers, advanced steadily, forming sprawling lines that stretched across the horizon. Their intention was simple: encircle and crush the small contingent of knights through sheer volume of attack. Archers were deployed to rain arrows on the knights from a distance, infantry formed the center to absorb the initial shock, and cavalry prepared to flank and encircle. Yet even as they moved forward, the knights were not passive. Their commanders had spent weeks studying the terrain, analyzing the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and planning precisely how to exploit the situation. The battlefield itself played a pivotal role. The knights had chosen a narrow valley flanked by hills, limiting the enemy's ability to deploy the full extent of their massive numbers. Natural obstacles, rocky outcrops, a small river, and marshy ground, channeled the enemy forces into tight, vulnerable formations. The knights knew that in close quarters, the numerical advantage of the 26,000 would be blunted, while the superior training and armor of their force could dominate. By forcing the enemy into a confined space, the knights transformed a hopelessly uneven battle into a contest where strategy and skill mattered more than size. The initial engagement began with a calculated provocation. The knights sent a small vanguard forward, lightly skirmishing with the enemy and then retreating in an apparent panic. This feigned flight was designed to lure the enemy into overextending themselves, drawing units out of formation and creating gaps that could later be exploited. The tactic worked. Ambitious commanders of the larger army, seeing the knights seemingly retreat, ordered a premature advance. Their formations, once compact and controlled, became stretched and chaotic, making them vulnerable to the disciplined counterattacks that followed. Once the enemy was positioned disadvantageously, the knights launched their first major charge, Mounted on powerful war horses, armored from head to toe, they thundered down the valley in tight wedge formations. The impact was devastating. The concentrated force of the charge shattered enemy lines, sending panicked soldiers scattering and creating a domino effect of disarray. Archers and infantry, who had thought they were secure, suddenly found themselves facing a wall of steel and hooves that could not easily be stopped. The noise, the speed and the sheer ferocity of the knights' assault compounded the psychological shock, further weakening morale among the opposing troops. The knights' strategy relied heavily on mobility and timing. Instead of engaging in prolonged direct combat with the entire army, they focused on striking weak points, exploiting disorganization, and retreating before the enemy could regroup. Repeated charges targeted flanks, exposed commanders, and concentrated pockets of soldiers. Each assault was precise, calculated, and supported by the overall coordination of the 500 knights. While the enemy had numbers, they lacked the ability to react swiftly to these sudden, concentrated strikes. Every maneuver by the knights created confusion, eroded cohesion, and amplified the effectiveness of their comparatively tiny force. A key element of the battle was psychological warfare. The knights' reputation for fearlessness, combined with their disciplined formations, created an aura of invincibility. Soldiers of the larger army, already unnerved by the aggressive tactics and sudden charges, began to hesitate at critical moments. Panic spread rapidly through crowded formations. Some units broke entirely, fleeing into their own lines and creating further disorder. The knights exploited every instance of hesitation, turning fear into a weapon as effective as any sword or lance. Despite the overwhelming odds, individual acts of valor also defined the engagement. Knights fought with a combination of skill, endurance, and courage that inspired their comrades. One could imagine a small contingent holding a critical choke point, repelling waves of infantry while signaling for reinforcements. Another group might execute a daring flanking maneuver, striking at the enemy's command center and targeting officers to sow confusion. Each act, while seemingly small in isolation, collectively shaped the flow of the battle, demonstrating the profound impact of leadership and individual heroism in the midst of chaos. The battle was not static. The enemy, frustrated by repeated failures to break the knights' lines, attempted counterattacks. Cavalry units sought to encircle the knights, and fresh infantry were thrown into the fray. Yet, the knights' discipline and coordination allowed them to respond fluidly. Formations were adjusted on the fly, retreats were executed in perfect order, and new charges were launched at moments when the enemy was most vulnerable. In this way, the smaller force effectively dictated the tempo of the battle, forcing the larger army to react rather than act on its own terms. As the day progressed, the cumulative effect of strategy, terrain, and morale became clear. The knights had turned the enemy's numbers into a liability. Crowded formations hindered movement, overextended lines created gaps, and demoralized soldiers faltered under pressure. Archers were unable to reposition effectively, cavalry units found themselves isolated, and infantry struggled to maintain cohesion. What should have been a decisive advantage for the larger army instead contributed to its unraveling. By the final stages of the engagement, the battle had evolved into a demonstration of the power of elite, disciplined forces against sheer numbers. The knights, maintaining cohesion and exploiting every opportunity, had achieved what seemed impossible. The enemy, despite their overwhelming numerical superiority, was thrown into disarray. Many units surrendered, fled, or were routed, and the battlefield became a testament to the consequences of underestimating a smaller, well-trained, and strategically adept force. In conclusion, the battle between 500 knights and 26,000 soldiers was defined by strategy, surprise, and valor. Terrain and preparation allowed the knights to neutralize numerical disadvantage. Tactical maneuvers, feigned retreats, and targeted strikes created chaos within enemy ranks. Psychological warfare and discipline magnified the impact of every action. Individual acts of courage and cohesive leadership transformed a desperate situation into a historic triumph. This battle remains a vivid example of how strategy, morale, and skill can outweigh numbers, and how the human spirit, organized, disciplined, and courageous, can achieve the extraordinary even against seemingly impossible odds. The battle in which 500 knights defeated an army of 26,000 did not end with the final clash of swords and the retreat of the enemy. Its consequences reverberated far beyond the immediate battlefield, leaving a profound mark on military strategy, political landscapes, and cultural memory. The aftermath of such a staggering and improbable victory highlights how a single engagement can alter the course of history, inspire legend, and redefine the principles of warfare. Immediately following the battle, the victorious knights were confronted with the task of managing the chaotic aftermath on the battlefield. Thousands of enemy soldiers lay wounded, disorganized, or fleeing, while the knights themselves, though relatively fewer in number, were exhausted from the continuous exertion of repeated charges and tactical maneuvers. The battlefield, strewn with debris, broken weapons, and fallen horses, became a physical testament to the extreme imbalance in numbers. The knights' ability to maintain discipline even in victory was crucial. They organized the captured prisoners, secured supplies, and ensured that any remaining enemy forces could not regroup for a counterattack. This careful post-battle management prevented their remarkable success from being squandered by logistical oversight. Politically, the victory had far-reaching consequences. In the medieval world, the outcomes of battles often determined the fate of kingdoms, principalities, and alliances. The smaller forces' triumph sent shockwaves through neighboring regions, elevating the status of the knight's lord and consolidating power in territories that might otherwise have been threatened by the larger army. Rivals who had expected an easy conquest were forced to reassess their ambitions, while the victorious knight's side gained legitimacy and influence. This battle became not just a military success, but a strategic turning point, reinforcing the authority of its leaders and demonstrating the potency of skill and discipline over sheer numbers. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the defeated army, the loss was humiliating and demoralizing. Troops who had believed that their numerical superiority would guarantee victory were confronted with the reality that coordination, leadership, and morale were far more decisive factors. Soldiers and commanders alike had to grapple with the psychological shock of being routed by such a small force. In contrast, the knights and their allies experienced a surge of confidence and morale. Their legendary status was cemented, and their example inspired other smaller forces facing larger opponents to believe that victory was possible through strategy, courage, and cohesion. The battle also had a lasting effect on military theory and tactics. Medieval commanders and chroniclers studied the engagement carefully, analyzing how a force 50 times smaller could defeat a massive army. Lessons from this battle influenced the deployment of elite troops, the use of terrain to neutralize numerical advantage, and the importance of maintaining morale and discipline. The concept of quality over quantity, where highly trained, well-led units could outweigh larger but less cohesive forces, became a recurring theme in military thought. Future commanders cited the engagement as an example of how careful planning, psychological insight, and tactical ingenuity could alter the outcome of seemingly unwinnable battles. The legend of the battle grew over time, blending historical record with elements of myth and storytelling. Chroniclers described the knights as almost superhuman, their valor magnified and their skills celebrated in poetry, songs, and tales told for generations. The story of 500 knights standing against overwhelming odds became a symbol of courage, discipline, and the triumph of human spirit against adversity. Even in cultures far removed from the original conflict, the narrative endured as a touchstone of martial heroism. Schools of chivalry, military academies, and historians would reference this engagement as a testament to how a small, determined force could shape the course of history. The battle's social and cultural ramifications extended beyond the immediate military sphere. For the knights, it reinforced the ideals of chivalry and martial honor. Their loyalty, courage, and tactical brilliance were held as models for subsequent generations. The concept of the elite, disciplined warrior capable of achieving extraordinary feats became embedded in medieval culture and influenced literature, religious narratives, and civic ideals. Meanwhile, the defeated army's loss served as a cautionary tale, illustrating that complacency, overconfidence, and poor coordination could lead to catastrophic failure regardless of numerical superiority. In terms of strategic legacy, the engagement demonstrated the enduring value of terrain and preparation. Commanders in subsequent campaigns emphasized reconnaissance, positioning, and the use of natural obstacles to neutralize the advantages of larger forces. The battle highlighted that a smaller, well-prepared force could dictate the terms of engagement, striking where the enemy was weakest and avoiding direct confrontation when disadvantageous. This principle echoed throughout military history, influencing campaigns centuries later, from medieval Europe to modern conflicts where smaller, elite forces consistently leveraged mobility, discipline, and tactical innovation to overcome larger opponents. The aftermath also left lasting marks on the battlefield itself. Sites of such epic confrontations often became symbolic locations, memorialized by chroniclers, historians, and local traditions. Pilgrimages, markers, or commemorations sometimes emerged where the knight's valor had turned the tide of history. The battlefield became both a literal and figurative landscape of heroism, caution, and inspiration. Even centuries later, historians could trace the lessons of the engagement through military texts, cultural narratives, and the collective memory of societies that revered courage and strategic brilliance. Finally, the engagement reinforced the timeless lesson that human factors, discipline, leadership, and morale, can outweigh numerical advantage. The 500 knights were not invincible because of luck or divine favor alone. Their success stemmed from preparation, cohesion, and the ability to exploit weaknesses in an overwhelming enemy. Their victory demonstrated that in warfare, as in life, intelligence, courage, and unity often triumph where sheer numbers fail. It also highlighted that legendary outcomes are rarely the result of brute force alone. They emerge from a complex interplay of planning, psychology, leadership, and skill. In conclusion, the aftermath and legacy of the battle between 500 knights and 26,000 soldiers extend far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The engagement reshaped political power, influenced military strategy, and became a symbol of discipline, courage, and tactical genius. It demonstrated that even the most overwhelming numerical advantage can be overcome by a smaller, well-trained, and strategically adept force. For centuries, this battle has inspired commanders, chroniclers, and storytellers alike, serving as a timeless reminder of what human determination, preparation, and valor can achieve in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The legacy of these 500 knights endures not just in historical records, but in the enduring inspiration they provide for generations seeking to understand the extraordinary power of strategy, unity, and courage.